By 1835, the United States Navy had established a global presence through half a dozen more or less permanent squadrons overseas in the Mediterranean, the West Indies, off Africa and Brazil in the North Pacific, and the East Indies. Some so-called squadrons were pretty small. Several consisted of only a single vessel. Still, they demonstrated that the United States was at least paying attention to the outside world, now a third of the way through the 19th century. All across the Pacific and elsewhere, there were still scores of islands, large and small, that had yet to be charted on any Western map. Further south, below Cape Horn, at the tip of South America, there were unexplored areas that could conceal, well, who knows what. The great age of exploration from the 15th to the 17th centuries had long since ended, but several European nations continued to sponsor exploring and scientific expeditions to learn more about the largely unknown areas of the world. The most famous of these was the voyage of the Beagle between 1831 and 1836, with young Charles Darwin on board. And even as Darwin conducted his investigations, the U.S. Congress appropriated $300,000 to fund an American expedition by the U.S. Navy into the Great South Sea to find and chart new islands and to learn as much as possible about the flora and fauna there. Not everyone was enthusiastic about it. Secretary of the Navy Mahlon Dickerson thought the whole idea was ridiculous. In his view, it was not the Navy's job to play explorer, especially because the ships would be encumbered with a gaggle of geologists, botanists, biologists, and conchologists. Do you know the word? A conchologist is someone who studies shells. Most naval officers were also skeptical. Even though it was a significant command composed of 6 ships, the expedition was to be primarily scientific in character and was to last for most of 4 years. Consequently, every captain to whom the command was offered turned it down. Apparently, you could do that in those days. Hard to imagine a Navy captain today declining a command because he thought it was beneath his dignity. Command of the expedition finally went to a mere lieutenant named Charles Wilkes. At first, he seemed to be an ideal selection. He was young, handsome, enthusiastic, a stickler for discipline. But that last characteristic became more pronounced once the expedition was underway, and before it was over, Wilkes would be universally hated by virtually everyone in the command. The 6 ships, 3 sloops, 1 brig, 2 schooners, departed Norfolk in August of 1838 and headed south to Cape Horn. Instead of rounding the Cape and heading north into the Pacific, the ships continued further south into the southern ice floes along the peninsula that juts out from Antarctica. Of course, no one knew at the time that it was a peninsula. Though others had reported seeing land among the ice, no one knew there was a continent there. This initial foray into the ice pack was fruitless. The only noteworthy event was the loss of the little steamer Seagull, the Navy's first commissioned steam warship. The expedition then headed north to Valparaiso, Chile, to Callao, Peru, and on to the islands of the South Pacific and Australia. In January and February of 1840, which of course was midsummer below the equator, the ships explored the southern ice pack. Several officers, including Wilkes, claimed to see mountains rising beyond the floating ice. Afterward, a major controversy would erupt about just who had been the first to see land beyond the ice pack and to determine that there was, in fact, a whole continent at the South Pole. Whoever it actually was, the land they espied was then, and still is, called Wilkes Land. From there, the expedition headed back to Australia, New Zealand, Tonga, and Fiji. At each of these places, the scientists went ashore to gather specimens, rocks, plants, shells, even animals, which they captured, killed, and stuffed. Soon, the ships were cluttered with hundreds of such specimens. At most of these stops, there were also interactions with the native population, not all of them positive. On Fiji, 2 American sailors ventured too far inland and were killed by a group of Fiji warriors. In the tradition of 19th century conceptions of honor, Wilkes retaliated by attacking the nearest village, killing 87 of its inhabitants, and compelling the rest to crawl to him on their hands and knees to beg forgiveness. After 2 years, Wilkes' tyrannical behavior had earned the enmity of most of his own officers and men. When the expedition touched in Hawaii a second time, those whose enlistments had expired demanded the right to quit. Wilkes encouraged them to re-enlist by flogging them until they did. The great United States exploring expedition returned to New York in the midsummer of 1842. In 4 years, it had circumnavigated the globe, sailing more than 85,000 miles, charting 280 previously unknown islands, as well as 1,500 miles of the Antarctic coast. The expedition also brought back an enormous assortment of rocks, plants, shells, and stuffed animals that made up the initial collection of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. In addition, the scientists who participated in the expedition published a number of books on botany, geology, and other topics that made a valuable contribution to 19th century science. As for Wilkes, he pressed charges against several of his subordinate officers who he claimed had conspired against him. A few of them were found guilty and suffered reprimands. But Wilkes, too, was court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer and received a public reprimand. He remained in the Navy, though, and was destined to play another important and equally controversial role in American naval history during the Civil War 20 years later. By the time the Wilkes expedition returned to New York in 1842, the United States was involved in tense relations with the Republic of Mexico over the southern boundary of Texas. Thousands of Americans had immigrated to Texas, then a province of Mexico, lured there by the Mexican government's promise of free land. Almost as soon as they arrived, the Texians, as they were called, chafed at Mexican oversight. In only a few years, they secured their independence from Mexico, creating the Republic of Texas. Almost at once, they petitioned for admission to the United States as a state. The U.S. Congress, concerned about provoking Mexico, which did not recognize Texas independence, fended off these overtures until 1845, when President James K. Polk, who had campaigned on an expansionist platform, convinced Congress to admit Texas as the 28th state. Mexico objected, as expected. More specifically, the Mexican government disputed the location of the southern border of the new state. The Texans themselves insisted that their southern boundary was the Rio Grande, but Mexico claimed the official boundary of the province was the smaller Nueces River, 150 miles further north. Both Mexico and the United States sent armed patrols into the disputed territory between the two rivers, and when they inevitably clashed, the United States declared war. The war with Mexico lasted from 1846 to 1848, and it was primarily a land war, though there were two important episodes that illustrated the shifting role of the U.S. Navy in the 19th century. The first such episode involved the American Naval Squadron on the west coast of North America. Like most of America's overseas squadrons, it was not especially impressive, consisting of only 3 ships, the largest of which was the frigate Savannah. Its commander, Commodore John Sloat, depended on news that came to him by sea, as did all the other overseas squadron commanders. Consequently, by the time news arrived, it was often 3 weeks or more out of date, and that made Sloat cautious. In 1846, Sloat heard a rumor that the United States had declared war, but he wondered if it was true. He knew that 4 years earlier, his predecessor, Thomas Ap Catesby Jones, had heard a similar rumor and had sailed up to Monterey and captured it. Then only a day later, Jones learned that the U.S. and Mexico were not at war after all. Oops. Somewhat sheepishly, Jones returned Monterey to its Mexican inhabitants. So now, 4 years later, Sloat was tentative. When he heard that war had been declared, he sent only 1 ship, the sloop Portsmouth, up to Monterey and ordered her captain only to protect American lives. It was several months before Sloat got confirmation that war had been declared this time and that several battles had already been fought in northern Mexico. When he arrived at Monterey with the rest of his squadron, he found that a group of Americans, led by Colonel John C. Fremont, who had been surveying the Red River, had not waited for official news. They had taken over the city and raised a flag in the name of the California Republic. That, by the way, is still the flag of the state of California. Sloat, assuming that Fremont had acted under orders, which was not the case, sent a landing party of sailors and Marines ashore to replace the California Bear flag with the American flag. Only then did Sloat learn that Fremont had acted on his own and began to wonder if he too had acted prematurely. The confusion surrounding the American seizure of Monterey illustrates the inherent difficulty of sending timely orders to the commanders of distant naval squadrons. As a rule, these commanders had to act independently, making their own best judgment about what was in the interest of the United States. In Fiji, Wilkes had not asked permission to attack a village. He did what he thought was best and moved on. In the 19th century, the U.S. government cared little about the lives of 87 Fiji islanders, but it did care about exceeding orders in wartime. If a squadron commander guessed wrong, he could be in real trouble. Sloat, pleading ill health, turned command of the squadron over to Robert F. Stockton, who proved to be as aggressive as Sloat was cautious. Stockton absorbed Fremont's group into his command and transported it to Southern California, where he captured both San Diego and Los Angeles, though the Mexican population of Los Angeles rose in revolt and recaptured the city almost at once. The Americans took Los Angeles back again in January of 1847, when 150 U.S. soldiers under Brigadier General Stephen Kearny arrived after a harrowing overland march from Santa Fe, New Mexico. After that, Stockton and Kearny bickered about who was in charge. Here's another aspect of squadron command in the 19th century. Today, the U.S. Army and Navy are both part of the Department of Defense, but in the 19th century, they were completely separate and often rival services. And there was no protocol about combined operations. Did a Commodore outrank a Brigadier General? Kearny didn't think so, and he preferred charges against both Stockton and Fremont for challenging his authority. In the end, the American conquest of California was due more to the small size of the Mexican garrison than to effective or efficient American leadership. And while this campaign was a sideshow to the main events in Mexico, it had a profound impact on the history of the United States. Indeed, American possession of California, confirmed in the subsequent peace settlement, proved historic, especially when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento only a few months later, and tens of thousands of new immigrants rushed into California. Meanwhile, on the east coast of Mexico, the U.S. Navy found itself in the unfamiliar, indeed virtually unprecedented situation of having unchallenged maritime supremacy. During its previous wars against Britain and France, the United States had often been blockaded by its superior enemy. Now, the U.S. Navy imposed a blockade on Mexico. Indeed, recognizing that it could not compete with the United States at sea, Mexico sold its seagoing warships to Britain when the war began, keeping only a few small harbor defense craft to protect its cities. That allowed elements of the U.S. Navy to range up and down the Gulf Coast and attack Mexican cities almost at will. Matthew Perry took several shallow draft warships up the Grijalva River to seize the city of Tabasco. And further north, another squadron under David Conner captured the town of Tampico. But the biggest naval action in the Gulf was the amphibious landing at Veracruz. It took place on March 9, 1847, and was the largest amphibious assault the United States had ever attempted up to that time. Some 10,000 U.S. Army soldiers under the command of Major General Winfield Scott climbed down into surf boats manned by sailors who rowed them ashore. On this occasion, the Army and Navy managed to work together. When the surf boats crunched up onto the sand, the soldiers climbed out over the sides and rushed up to the top of the dunes where they planted an American flag. There was no resistance. Over the next several weeks, Scott's army captured Veracruz and then advanced inland, fighting and winning several battles en route to Mexico City. The capture of that historic city effectively ended the war. A contingent of U.S. Marines from the fleet accompanied Scott's army and assisted in the seizure of the citadel of Chapultepec outside the Mexican capital. Perhaps because of their uniforms, Scott chose them to stand guard in the Capitol building, the halls of Montezuma. Because a handful of Marines had also accompanied the overland expedition to Tripoli back in 1805, an anonymous author composed the words of what subsequently became the Marine Corps hymn with its famous opening couplet, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." The U.S. victory in this war not only resolved the Texas-Mexican border issue, it added an enormous expanse of new Western land to the national domain. The Mexican Cession, as it was called, was huge, more than 500,000 square miles, covering an area that includes what is now California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and parts of New Mexico and Colorado. Almost at once, the acquisition of all that new territory triggered a furious national debate about the future of slavery in those areas and was an important milestone on the path to the American Civil War. Even as these historic events played out, advances in maritime technology were changing the very character of the U.S. Navy, and for that matter, of all Western navies. The most transformative of these was steam. The first steam-powered vessel was Robert Fulton's Clermont, which carried passengers on the Hudson River from New York to Albany as early as 1807. A few years later, Fulton built and launched the first steam-powered U.S. Navy warship, which he called the Demologos, though it was completed too late to take part in the War of 1812. The first purpose-built ocean-going steam warships in the U.S. Navy were the identical frigates Missouri and Mississippi, both of which were launched in 1841. They were side-wheel steamers and made their maiden voyages the next year. In 1843, en route to deliver a new American ambassador to China, the Missouri stopped in Gibraltar for a port visit. There, a spilled container of turpentine ignited a fire that quickly spread through the ship. Although the crew was able to evacuate before the fire reached the magazine, the ship exploded and was a complete loss. Her sister ship, the Mississippi, had better luck, though I guess it would be pretty hard to have worse luck. In 1847, the Mississippi had served as Matthew Perry's flagship during the amphibious landing at Veracruz during the Mexican War. And a few years later was Matthew Perry's flagship on his mission to Japan. On the other hand, the change from sail to steam was not the obvious move it seems to us today. There was an enormous logistical challenge to relying on steamships because of their constant need for coal. Coal-fueled steam engines, especially early steam engines, were appallingly inefficient. On average, such ships made about 6 to 8 miles of forward progress for each ton of coal they burned. That meant they had to be refueled regularly. The United States had plenty of coal. The problem was getting it to where it was needed. As one example, the U.S. warship Susquehanna, a side-wheel steamer like the Mississippi, departed Norfolk in June of 1851 to join the East Asian Squadron. She first steamed eastward to Madeira in the Azores. Because she could not make it all the way from there to the Cape of Good Hope on one load of fuel, she then recrossed the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro and then back across the Atlantic to the Cape of Good Hope. Then she zigzagged across the Indian Ocean, stopping at Zanzibar and Ceylon, passing through the Strait of Malacca, and finally arriving in the South China Sea. At all these places, the Susquehanna had to recoal, which required the entire crew spending several days of hard labor bringing the coal aboard in sacks and baskets, after which the ship and everything in it was filthy with coal dust. And of course, all that coal had to be purchased from foreign sources. These kinds of logistical nightmares did not apply to most European navies. They either operated near their home bases, or in the case of Britain, they possessed naval bases all around the world. On the Susquehanna's trip to the South China Sea, she had refueled at Cape Town, Ceylon, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And all of those ports were British. If the United States got into another war with Britain, those ports would be closed to her. That explains why the U.S. Navy clung to sail power longer than most European navies. Even so, when the United States dispatched a squadron under Matthew C. Perry to Japan in 1853, His squadron included 3 steam warships. Perry's assignment was to convince Japan to open its ports to Western trade. Up to then, Japan had embraced an isolationist policy. Foreigners, in their view, were the source of trouble and difficulty rather than wealth or enrichment. To the Japanese, Perry's arrival in Tokyo Harbor, then called Edo Harbor, was almost like an alien visitation, which in effect it was. With Perry's steamships belching black smoke, the Japanese did not know what to make of these big black ships that appeared to be on fire. The Japanese tried to put Perry off. He was told he could not anchor there. He was told he could not see government officials. He should leave immediately. But Perry was quietly firm and determined. He insisted that he be allowed to deliver a letter to the emperor from the President of the United States, and he would not leave until the letter was delivered. The Japanese eventually agreed. In an elaborately choreographed ceremony, Perry came ashore in a sedan chair and delivered the letter enclosed in a rosewood box. After that, he and his squadron left in order to give the Japanese an opportunity to consider their options. When Perry returned 6 months later, he was again quietly persistent. The result was the Treaty of Kanagawa, which marked an important milestone in the emergence of modern Japan. Perry had demonstrated that besides chasing pirates and slave traders, the U.S. Navy could also be an important tool of effective diplomacy. Perry, like virtually all other U.S. Navy officers at the time, was the product of a system in which young men became naval officers by essentially apprenticing themselves to the Navy as teenagers and learning on the job. It was a system that had worked for centuries, and traditionalists were loath to change it. By the 1840s, however, the complexity of the new steamships and of the more sophisticated ordnance on board led many to wonder if young men aspiring to become naval officers should first get some schooling ashore. There was no naval counterpart to West Point, the Army's military academy, which had existed since 1802. Old salts had not thought it necessary. One veteran insisted that teaching men to become naval officers in a classroom was like teaching ducks to swim in an attic. But an incident on the U.S. Navy training ship Somers in 1842 created an impetus to the establishment of a naval academy. The Somers was a sailing brig with a crew of 121, including 5 officers, 7 midshipmen, and 74 apprentice boys, for whom the ship was a kind of seagoing schoolhouse. One of the 7 midshipmen was 19-year-old Philip Spencer, who happened to be the son of the Secretary of War, John C. Spencer. Young Spencer had a history as a troublemaker, and somewhere in the middle of the Somers voyage across the Atlantic, he proposed to 2 of the ship's petty officers that they should take over the ship, kill the captain, and turn to piracy. It was an absurd plot, and it was soon betrayed to the ship's captain, Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, who had Spencer arrested and clapped in irons. But the Somers was so small, there was no convenient place to confine Spencer. He was secured on deck, where he continued to communicate with other crewmen. Mackenzie feared that he would undermine morale and even the ship's security. He decided the situation was too dangerous to tolerate. He convened a court-martial, tried Spencer and the 2 petty officers for mutiny, and hanged all three of them. Well, as you can imagine, that created quite a sensation when the Somers arrived back in the United States in 1843. Mackenzie faced a court-martial. But the Navy was determined not to undermine a captain's authority in dealing with mutiny, and the court found him not guilty. Still, the incident suggested that perhaps there were better ways to train midshipmen than by sending them to sea. 2 years later, in 1845, the government established a naval school at Fort Severn in Annapolis. Initially, it was quite small, with only 7 faculty and 56 midshipmen. Some of these midshipmen had already served a number of years at sea, and they received only a single year of instruction. Others stayed for 2. Not until 1850 did the U.S. Naval Academy establish a traditional 4-year academic program. By the middle of the 19th century, the Navy was firmly established as a permanent element of the United States. There was a Navy Department, a Secretary of the Navy who sat in the President's cabinet, and now a Naval Academy. The Navy had fought a successful overseas war with Mexico and conducted a large-scale amphibious landing at Veracruz, and its overseas squadrons showed the flag and protected American trade all over the world. The U.S. Navy remained smaller and less capable than most of the navies of Europe, and especially the Royal Navy, but in a mere half-century, it had grown from a handful of fur-built frigates, as the British derisively called it, into a global force.